Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
To the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am, as always, happy to be with you, hoping you're having a great day, whatever that day entails. It is a lovely sunny day here in Northern California, which of course means that the pollen is going crazy, as it always does in the spring, and so my sinuses are not happy, but what else is new? I just feel like it wouldn't be a full day if my sinuses weren't doing something productive. At least something about me is productive, right? Yeah, let's go with that. At any rate, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I hope you're ready for another author interview. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, we are switching now to a collection of short stories by Heather Mateus Sappenfield. The book is called Lyrics for Rock Stars, and let me give you the description on the back. Now, I do have an ARC copy of this. I was sent an ARC copy of this, although it is out now. So if you have this book, or if you see this book and what's on the back of the book that you see is different than mine, that's the reason. But the back of my book says, this prize-winning collection brings to life skiers, ranchers, cyclists, suffragettes, tourists, supermodels, dead pigs, burro racers, religious beet farmers, immigrant miners, scorned lovers, penitent centenarians, and musicians. Some historical, some contemporary, its stories revel in their Western settings, as varied as the region's landscape. Yet each story explores the way society's values clash with our individual desires, compelling us, despite tears or laughter, to weave our lives through these opposing forces, often creating not a lifeline, but a noose. Sounds a little dark there at the end, huh? This is a collection of 17 short stories, I believe. Maybe I have that number wrong. Let me just double check. But they are divided into, the book is divided into two sections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Wisdom. And in Songs of Innocence, you get... for me, I felt like Songs of Innocence tended to be more like songs of loss of innocence, and you can tell from the description on the back of the book that there is a lot going on with these stories, that there is a lot of human emotion and life experiences and just situational experiences packed into these stories, as is often the case with short stories, because you do have to really economize your storytelling because it is a short story. So yes, there are 17 short stories within the book, again, divided into two sections, Songs of Innocence, Songs of Wisdom. For myself personally, I think I enjoyed the second half of the book, Songs of Wisdom, more than the first half of the book. I'm not saying I did not enjoy the first half of the book, but because it was Songs of Innocence, and as I said, it felt like songs of the loss of innocence, it was sometimes difficult for me particularly to have those experiences with the children as they were kind of losing that sense of innocence, realizing what happens in the world, realizing that parents are fallible, or life is not maybe what they expected it to be, and so that was a little more difficult for me. As you know, I always relate everything to my nieces and the children in my life, and so that was difficult. Second half felt more comfortable for me. I mean, still, it wasn't things that are necessarily enjoyable, but things that we all go through, and questions that we ask, experiences that we might have. So that was the second half, and felt a little bit more of my speed for reading. As you know, I struggle with short stories. They are not my favorite genre. I am learning to appreciate them more than I did before, but as I've said before, I always want more. If I fall in love with characters, then I want more from those characters, and short stories just give me that little snippet. And so I'm like, yes, but I want more. One more thing I will say about the book is that Heather did send me a link to an Audible copy of the book. And so I was able to listen to the stories, which is something that I enjoy doing. As you know, I love listening to audiobooks. But the narrator for this audiobook is Michael Crouch. And I thought that name sounded familiar when Heather mentioned it. And it's because he has narrated some of the Percy Jackson series. And so once he started talking, I'm like, yes, I know this voice. I absolutely know this voice. And so I'm used to him in that kind of young adult mode with all the different voices that he does for Percy Jackson, but he really does an incredible job with these stories in terms of going from those songs of innocence with children as young as 5 or 6 and making me believe that he was that age. Sometimes it's hard to do a child's voice as an adult, but he goes from young children to the oldest living man who's over 100 in one story, and he is convincing in all of them. So I really enjoyed his narration of Lyrics for Rock Stars. I'm going to go ahead and turn it now over to the interview so that Heather can talk more about the book rather than me. So again, the book is called Lyrics for Rock Stars. The author is Heather Mateus Sappenfield.
Hi, Heather. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
I am happy to have you here. We are here to talk about your collection of short stories. The book is called Lyrics for Rock Stars. But before we get to the book, if you would take a few moments to share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I live in Vail, Colorado, right in the heart of the Rocky Mountains at about 8,000 feet. And I live in a 600 square foot log home. I guess some would call that a tiny house, and we love it. My husband and I live here, and we're about maybe 150 yards from Gore Creek. And I have a writing loft in this little tiny house. It's up above, and that's where I do my writing and where I'm talking to you from right now. And then as far as who I am, I've always been a very athletic person as well as intellectual, kind of divided right down the middle like a good Gemini should be. And so I've always been sort of an adventurer and had a lot of things that I've done athletically or physically, and like, teaching skiing for Vail Resorts or ski touring in the backcountry in the wintertime, or mountain bike racing. Or years ago, I did something called the Race Across America on a women's cycling team where we went from San Diego all the way to Atlantic City, New Jersey. It was a relay race. And I've really enjoyed those aspects and what I learned about myself through that. But in recent years, I've really come to appreciate, I think it's from all the writing and all the time I spend with characters, sort of the internal adventure also of looking within and just finding out things about yourself and facing challenges within yourself. And I think a lot of times we adventurers, when we head out or do things like that, no matter what it might be, we choose some sort of a physical challenge to try to get into that internal space. So as a writer, that really fascinates me, and just how we all are working and striving toward that understanding or avoiding it.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that. I feel like I have a million questions about what it's like to live in a 600 square foot house, but probably not the place for that. You watch shows like Tiny House Nation, and I'm always amazed at how efficient people can make their tiny spaces. So
exactly, yes, yeah.
So
it's like living on a boat. We just don't have anything extra.
Yep, but you have your loft, which I think is cool. So you've got a place for writing, and
yeah.
excellent. Well, again, the book is a collection of short stories. It's called Lyrics for Rock Stars. Can you give kind of an overview of the collection as a whole?
Well, there are 17 stories in the collection, and it's called Lyrics for Rock Stars, but it is divided into two sections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Wisdom. And the Songs of Innocence it kind of goes through children, youngest into teens, and then Songs of Wisdom deal with adults. And all of the stories, again, kind of look through dysfunctional families or struggles, how we grow and become the people we are. And it sort of, I hope, by the end, sort of revolves back on itself as far as a collection, with the question of what truly is wisdom, and what do we decide is wisdom, and how do we incorporate that into our lives. And several of the stories are historical. I am a Colorado girl, and I absolutely love the West. And so it is very much rooted in place. Place is a character within the entire collection. And if you see the cover, it's actually the skyline of Denver with the Rocky Mountains behind it at sunset. I'm really happy with the cover. It turned out so beautifully. However, I was in the Las Vegas area a couple of weeks ago driving through Henderson, and I looked, and who knew, like Las Vegas, and then there were these beautiful snow-capped mountains behind it. And I thought, wow, that looks kind of like Denver. And I know Salt Lake can look that way as well. So I think it really speaks to the West overall, and is a tribute to this area as well.
Yeah, I actually feel a little sad because I have an art copy, so I do not have cover art. It's just a plain white. But I looked it up, so I've seen I've seen the final product, and it is beautiful.
Yeah. Jessica Bell designed that. I think she's in Britain, but she did a beautiful job. Yeah,
I agree.
See, art copies are cool and all, but sometimes you don't get the cover art, and then you're sad. You can always look it up online, which is what I did. But it is a little strange to get a book that just has a white cover and some really basic font. But the actual cover is beautiful. So we're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. I'm way ahead of myself today. We're going to take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Heather will be talking more about her short stories, Lyrics for Rock Stars, what was the inspiration behind the collection, how she decided which stories to include, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Heather Mateus Sappenfield. We are talking about her collection of short stories called Lyrics for Rock Stars.
You've kind of answered this already with the two parts, Songs of Innocence, Songs of Wisdom, but did you have an initial inspiration for the stories or the collection?
No, so I have written this collection, but I also write novels, and so these stories, let me backtrack. This book has been 20 years in the making, and I wrote the first story shortly after I resigned from my teaching position at high school, language arts, to stay home with my daughter because she had started speaking with the Australian accent of her daycare lady. And I thought, better stay home.
I'm sorry.
That's
hilarious.
And so as she was taking her first steps, I was taking my first steps as a writer. And they were really scary for me because it's what I ultimately wanted most in life. And so the stories, as far as their arc, sort of reach and match sort of my growth through that adult phase of life, from being a mother up through, all the different marriage things. Some of them are rooted in my experience. Some of them I heard about or witnessed, those things, those obsessions that stay with you as a writer that you need to work through. And so the very first story I wrote was called Coloring Beyond the Lines. And it's about a mother who just fritzes and takes off to find some wild horses. And that was very much, just one of those tough days, your mom at home, and you're thinking, what have I done? I've given up my career. Here I am. And it just, all of the stories sort of came from things that I heard about that fascinated me or that really resonated, or I thought, one of them about a widow who has an encounter with a bear. And she's lost her husband kayaking. I had a girlfriend who lost her husband ice climbing, and she handled it so stoically and so beautifully, and it stuck with me for years. I knew I would write about that at some point. And simultaneously, if you bring elements together as a writer, I also had been out jogging behind my house or trail running, and I was coming down trying to avoid a storm, and literally just out the corner of my eye saw this big brown thing moving, barreling along, down across the mountain. And I stopped and watched, and it was a huge male bear, a boar, that went down and up and over and across the trail in front of me. And we were both fleeing the storm. But if I hadn't stopped, we would have definitely had a close encounter. And so those two elements kind of came together in the story. So each story is something from living in this region, that speaks to the whole sort of thematic arc of how the stories are shaped there.
I was really hoping you were going to say it was Sasquatch, but okay, a bear, that's dramatic enough. Almost having it.
Huge, that bear. So, yeah, those things.
Well, I'm glad that you avoided a direct encounter with the bear.
Yeah, me too.
So there's two sections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Wisdom. Where then does the title come from, Lyrics for Rock Stars?
So Lyrics for Rock Stars, there's a title story, and it's actually about a pregnant gold digger who's vacationing. She's from Chicago, and they're vacationing where her husband's family goes every summer up high in the Rocky Mountains in a little town called Silverville, which is modeled after many of the mining towns in Colorado. So I'm hoping that you kind of envision any one of the many different towns that we have here. And she realizes on this trip the error of her ways, and wants to leave her husband, really struggles with what she's going to do, and she ends up meeting what she assumes is just a singing hippie who's fishing on this river, and decides she wants to run off and marry him or whatever. He gives her a spark of intuition that helps her see reality. And it's funny, that story, I thought for the longest time, being a mom, I was identifying with the pregnant mother, but this is when the collection actually really came together, which is only a couple years ago. I realized that I actually was more identified with that singing hippie because they have this exchange. I can read the short exchange to you if you like. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So she's sitting with him and she's talking to the singing hippie, and she's realized that he's actually a famous songwriter. She looked at him. So you're famous. You write songs. Even in this light, he was wiry, and he wore a T-shirt that read, "Let Love Rule." He reeked of marijuana. Tuned some, lyrics mostly. For rock stars, people I've heard of? Stars, sure. Do you need anything? Like who? He sat down facing her and took in her proportions. You're a Mini Cooper stretched into a caddy. No wonder you're revving so hard. Oh, I forgot to mention, she's going into labor. People I'd hear on the radio? Well, I juice out my passions, my obsessions, and they breathe each day on the radio, live night after night after night on tours. I don't know if I'd like that, turning on the radio and hearing my life. He shook his head. Stubble furred his cheeks. I dig it. It makes me part of each body that grooves to my beat. And when I heard that passage, I realized that each of these stories was basically my lyrics. And as a writer, you put out, you pour your heart out and you send it out into the world. And every reader reads that story and interacts with you in some way. And granted, they bring to it their own experience of the story, but they bring to it their own tune as well. And so for each reader, that story is something completely different. And it just made me really, that's when I knew what the title was and how it all needed to fit together. Yeah.
I like it. I really like that analogy and how the title of the book came about, because it has to be weird to work so hard on something, whether it's short stories, whether it's a full-length novel, and then just send it out into the world to be read and picked apart and discussed in ways that you maybe had never even thought of before.
Right. Yeah, I'm always surprised. And it's funny, I've had so many people come up to me or write me and say, oh, this is my favorite story, or I love this story. And I'm always so surprised, about the one story in the beginning, one story in the end, everybody likes different stories and identify with them for different reasons.
Sure, yeah. We've talked about a couple of the stories, but are there any of the 17 that you would particularly like to highlight?
Not particularly. I love them all. There's a couple of them that are humorous that I really enjoy. I think, I write books and our stories are a bit like children, and I love them all. I do especially love the final story, The Oldest Living Man in America. The collection is dedicated to my grandfather, who actually was the oldest living man in America for a time. And this isn't my grandfather by any means, but it made me think about, wow, the amount of history that he had seen. And for this particular character, it stretches from the Civil War all the way to the moonwalk, the first man on the moon, and he's watching that as he's narrating the story. And I think I love the story because it reaches across all of that, and because of the grace that he finds, but also because I think as far as the story at the end does, I hope, a lot of work with forgiveness and sort of curving the collection back on itself so that you can look back at the stories and think, and reassess them.
Thank you for that. That's so cool about your grandfather. I remember reading the dedication and seeing that he had been at one point the oldest man in America. My husband has a similar story. It's his mother's great grandmother, I think, but she lived to be 117. And
wow.
Her story, yeah. But her story also started, she was a slave, and then there's a picture of her with my mother-in-law when my mother-in-law is about 5.
Wow.
It's so cool.
Wow.
So I love that. The amount, like you said, the amount of history that had to have been seen by this person.
Yes. And one of the things and one of the themes of the book that fascinates me, especially in the West, is how we can move through history without even really fully realizing it, and be at a place, for I don't know how many times, and then all of a sudden you realize what happened there, or you learn something about it. For example, the story Clan, in the collection takes place on Table Mountain or Table Mesa outside of Denver, which back in the day was one of the meeting places for the Ku Klux Klan here, and we had a huge Ku Klux Klan community. I hate to say it, and they would gather there and burn crosses and all that at night. And I never even knew that. When I finally heard that, I was so shocked, and I knew, okay, I have to write about that somehow, and how that the aha moment of that.
Yeah, although I keep seeing various memes on social media lately that say something along the lines of, "Yeah, I'm tired now of living through historically significant events." Like the events of the last year, people are like, "Yeah, I'm done now. Can we move on?"
Absolutely, yeah, we're definitely doing that right now.
I will say one thing. For the last year and a half or so, we've definitely had some historic events and some things that have gone on, whether in the world, in the U.S., in our own lives. It's been crazy, and I'm ready for something a little more normal, although I'm not sure anymore what normal is. Not sure I ever knew what normal was, but we're going to go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about some of Heather's other writings. She does write across genres, so she's got a wide array. I just made a new word, array. See, I can't even say it, variety and array. She's got a wide variety of different genres that she writes in. Let's take that break so I can see if I can get my words back. You are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am your tongue-tied host, Sarah, who is desperately trying to get through this interview with actual words and not things that I've made up. Let's go back to the interview so that Heather can do more of the talking.
In terms of writing, I know that you are, your website says that you're a journalist. You mentioned that you write novels. What draws you to writing short stories?
Well, I think that when a story comes to me, I sit with it for quite a while and get a feel for what it needs to be. And if it's shorter and it's just this moment in time when the character will be going through something and it's just more impactful and more powerful to write about that moment, then that's a short story. Whereas if it's something that would be broader and reaching where we need to follow the character's journey over a period of years or through a longer stretch of time, then that's going to end up being a novel. So that's what determines what it is as far as the form. But, I also write across genres. So I write for adults, but I also have 2 young adult novels. And I have a middle grade novel, which is coming out in February 1st, it's releasing, of 2022. And so I also listen to the narrator and how the narrator seems to want to tell the story, and then kind of assess how the story will be interact with the reader, and then decide from there what the genre will be.
Oh, fun. I love that. And yeah, I've always been fascinated by people who either A, write across genres, or B, stick to one genre. Like on certain days I'd be like, how can you only stick to one genre? And other days I'd be like, how can you not stick to one genre? So that's very cool. Do you want to talk a little bit about the young adult story? Can you talk a little bit about the storyline in that one?
Well, I have published two young adult novels. The first one, when I was teaching high school, actually, I lost 3 students to suicide, and that was something. That was my first book that I wrote about. You know, this girl in the first chapter actually attempts suicide and fails, and then she wakes up in the hospital and realizes how much she's hurt the people around her, and she never really considered that. And so it's how she almost becomes sort of a mystery novel as she figures out how she got to that place and how she's going to work her way out of it. And that's called The View from Who I Was. And then the other young adult novel I wrote was actually a Colorado Book Awards finalist, and it's called Life at the Speed of Us. And that has a lot of snowboarding and skiing and on the mountain things, and it has time travel in it as well. And the girl has lost her mother and ends up time traveling back inadvertently to the days when the Ute Indians used to inhabit this valley before the ski areas and all of that. And it's actually the days when they were being forced out of these ancestral lands. And so she has this contrast between being with them and they're starving and being hunted down to coming back in time and walking into a lodge and someone's offering her a tissue and, you know, she's going to buy a brownie. Like the contrast of those modern times versus that, and that definitely gives her perspective and helps her move along as well. So that one's also historical and investigating. The Vail, actually, the ski area here was formed by a huge fire that was blamed on the Utes, a sort of PR smear, in my opinion, back in the day, so it investigates that as well, and how that happened, and how the fire started.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you do any particular research for the short story collection?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, the stories deal with several different historical periods. So, you know, and sometimes they were generated by discovering something from history. But I'm always really careful, at least for me, you know, everybody has their process. But for me with history, I tend to look at the initial facts and kind of get a feel for where things are and touch points. And then I like to write the story and then go back and do a lot more research. Because for me, that tends to make the characters more real and their actions more real. I find if I've done too much research, sometimes I'm writing toward the history instead of toward the character's journey.
Working on anything now that you can or would like to talk about?
Well, you know, I'm in that place. I think writers kind of dread it overall. So I have Lyrics just came out, and then my middle grade book is just heading now into production with Fitzroy Press. And then I have a novel that I finished that is complete. It's ready for market, and it's an upmarket literary humorous fiction book, and it's all polished and it's beautiful. And so actually right now I'm just literally starting a brand new novel. And it's so, that transition from writing that is so polished and ready, and then into that place where you've got to give yourself permission to write really crummy sentences and just find new stuff and, you know, take everything out of the cupboards and throw it onto the page as far as what fits with the story. It's such an interesting transition, and it's always kind of hard for me to move from the one to the other. But that's where I am, and I'm starting this new novel.
I would imagine that is both exciting and slightly terrifying.
transition. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you a plotter or a pantser when it comes to your how you write?
Well, it's interesting. So I am dyslexic, and because of that, I guess it's one of the traits that some dyslexic people have, but stories tend to come to me pretty fully formed. And they're not like really super specifically plotted out, but I have a really general sense of where things are going, the whole thing. And so I tend to pants it right through as far as like drawing at what's out of my head, and then I go back and I really look at the plot and how things are fitting together, and then if there's historical things or research to be done, then that's added at that point. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm curious, as someone who is dyslexic, how has that either affected or positively or negatively how you write?
Well, I think in many ways it has helped me tremendously with creativity because I'm such a big picture person, and it helps with that a ton. And then it kind of keeps me from getting into that sort of narrow editing phase that can kind of hold you back in the creating phase. And then when I do move into the editing phase, it can be tough for me initially. But I think I've trained myself to be so absorbed in it that I overcompensate. And I tend to be really like, I take craft to the next extreme because it is, because I tend to see words, put words backwards or put sentences out of order. So for me in the editing process, I really, really, really take my time and am very, very careful.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I have several people that I know and one in my family, and just learning how they see things differently than maybe how I see them, and how you can look at a word 4 or 5 times and it says one word, you're convinced you know that word, and then somebody comes along and says, no, that word is this.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, it's just it's an interesting way the brain works.
Definitely.
So it sounds like you've been writing for quite a while in one way or another. Is it something that you've always wanted to do?
From the time I was a little girl, I don't know why, but I just knew I was going to be a writer and live in the mountains. And here I am. And I don't know, it just amazes me how life can turn out. It is something that I always wrote, and I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. And when I went to college, I was a journalism major initially, and then I switched and got my teaching certificate and English degree. And so I taught English for a while, but when I resigned and stayed home, I became a journalist. And then, it took a lot of courage for me to really jump into writing fiction, and because I wanted it so much, and I was afraid. And so, but I gave it a shot, and it wasn't easy, I'll say that, because I think a lot of the things that I had learned as an English teacher did not work to my benefit as an author, and I had to unlearn some of the ways that I looked at story and at books and creation of stories. I made a lot of assumptions as a teacher that I don't think are necessarily true as an author, and so that was one aspect. And then I ended up actually, to really help me along, ended up going and getting my master's of fine arts at Pacific University, and that really turned the tables for me, and that's when my career started to take off.
Thank you for that. Out of your own experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I do, and I think my advice, everybody has their own way of creating a book, and I honor anyone who can actually write a short story or get a novel written, because it's hard. It's not easy to sit down and make yourself do it and get it out there. But my advice, in all honesty, is to listen to what the story needs to be. Not get caught up in, okay, what else is out there, and what's this, and what's this, and what's this, and what's this, but really, what's the story that you have inside you? And to write that story first, and then to take a look at what you've written and say, okay, what do I have here? What is this? And then to approach getting it published based upon the story being what it needed to be first. And then probably it'll be a much more authentic piece of work and true to you. And maybe as you look at it, you see elements that might need to be tweaked or whatever to fit the market. But for originality to really be there, I think you really have to pay attention to yourself and what really needs to come onto the page rather than necessarily the market.
Okay, last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about Heather's advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. And the conclusion of my interview with author Heather Mateus Sappenfield. Before the break, we were talking about her advice for aspiring authors and writing what you want to write, not necessarily writing what's popular or, write the story that's in you to write. And we'll go ahead and get back to that conversation since we pick up kind of in the middle of it and in the middle of my response to Heather's last comment.
Yeah, I mean, and especially just because you were in a phase where young adult vampire books are popular doesn't mean that's the book that you're meant to write.
Right. And
even
though you could write that book, someone could definitely, do I want to write that vampire book? And here I go and write a book and get it published but I don't know. I find it more gratifying to be true to the stories and to write these stories that are authentic and unique and not generated by necessarily wanting to make a lot of money.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. When you take the time to read for yourself, not doing research or something, do you have favorite authors and genres?
So I have, it's a thing I discovered in the last couple of years, which is, and I think it's true for a lot of people, is that I'm sort of a type of reader, not necessarily across genre. And the type of writing that I enjoy is really well crafted, fairly literary, but not over the top, kind of on that literary line, just over from upmarket and into literary, really nicely plotted with true characters. And if a story has that, it doesn't really matter whether it's mystery or young adult or middle grade or literary, I'm probably going to enjoy it. And so as far as favorite writers, and thus I'm that kind of a writer. So I write across genre, but you'll get that from me, as far as it'll be really well crafted. And, and that's, I work hard to craft it. Let's put it that way. I don't know if it comes out that way in the end, but I hope so. And, strong characters and things like that. As far as favorite books, I just recently read Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey and was stunned by that book and loved it. I just finished Circe by Madeline Miller, and I loved that book as well. And I love Gail Honeyman, and Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine. But then Louise Penny got me right through most of the pandemic. I went all through the Inspector Gamache books, and I really enjoy her writing. And then, again, crossing that boundary, there's Patrick Ness, who wrote A Monster Calls, and as far as middle grade fiction. But I think everybody should read that book. Oh, it's so beautiful. And then Neil Schusterman's Challenger Deep, that's a piece of art, that book.
I'm glad you mentioned Louise Penny because it reminded me that she's on my TBR list, and I need to get back to that. I keep hearing so many good things about her.
She's wonderful, and I literally just saw in the news in Publishers Weekly today that she and Hillary Clinton are going to write a book together.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
The way Bill did with James Patterson, she's going to do one with Louise Penny.
Cool. I don't think I sometimes wonder if James Patterson is human or if he ever sleeps.
Yeah, it's crazy.
The amount of content that he puts out. I know you have a website, so if you can share your website as well as where people can interact with you on social media.
You bet. They could find me at heathermateussappenfield.com. And social media, Facebook, I'm at Heather Mateus Sappenfield, as well as on Instagram, and then on Twitter, I'm at Alpine Heather. Oh, and I also wanted to be sure to mention the audiobook of Lyrics for Rock Stars is unbelievably good. Michael Crouch, who's one of the best in the business, did the voices, and he literally, from an 8-year-old girl to that 109-year-old man, it's unbelievable the job he did narrating it. So highly recommend.
Nice. Thank you. I love audiobooks, so I'm always glad to hear when there's an audiobook version.
Yeah.
And thank you also for the social media cover. Alpine Heather's a little easier to say than your full name. That's a mouthful. I thought my hyphenated last name was long, but
well, I took that name I started using Mateus in my writing name after my grandfather passed away, and that's the Americanized version of my maiden name, his last name. And I just felt really strongly about taking that back. Yeah. And it's Azorian, and they came as migrant, they came as migrant workers and to the United States, and actually were indentured servants in Hawaii for Dole, picking pineapple, and then Dole sponsored their arrival in the United States in California, Orange County. And I just felt strongly that they should not be ashamed and not have to change their name. And so I took it back.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, Heather, we've talked about a variety of different things so far, but is there anything that we haven't covered, especially as pertains to lyrics for rock stars, that you wanted to mention at this point?
You had asked about short stories, and there's one thing that I would say about short stories that is different from novels, in that in a short story, every sentence really counts. And I enjoy writing at that level, where every single sentence needs to be working toward one specific destination. And within this collection, it's interesting, then when you put a story within a collection, each sentence, I'm hoping, is 1, advancing the story itself, 2, advancing the themes or messages of that story, and then 3, advancing the overarching message of the collection. And so it's really kind of cool how short story collections can operate on so many levels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of them are some of them are just sort of a collection of stories that maybe don't have a lot to do with one another, but I think even with those, there's still connections that you can find within, because they are written by the same person, and so there's going to be some threads that connect things. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time out of your day to go to your loft and talk to me. I don't know. I just like that you're in your loft. But thank you so much thank you for talking to me about lyrics from your loft.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you again to Heather for not only talking to me about her short stories, her collection of short stories, Lyrics for Rock Stars, but also about some of her other writings, about writing in general, etc. Thank you, Heather, for putting up with my silly sense of humor and my seeming fascination with your loft. I can't help it. I have a very strange fascination with certain architectural designs, lofts, turrets, anything that's not unusual but slightly unusual. I don't know. Anyway, I've always wanted a loft. Maybe someday I will have a loft in a turret. Is that possible? Why not? I'll make it possible. I'll just make up a new architectural design. A loft in a turret. There's no good word combination there, is there? Somebody come up with a name for me for what a loft in a turret would be, or is. Maybe it already exists. I don't know. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation with Heather Mateus Sappenfield. I hope that you will join me for my next interview. Again, a collection of short stories. I always say it's amazing how connected sometimes my interviews can be, regardless of the fact that they are scheduled completely independently of one another. The authors don't know each other or know when they're scheduling, and so I find it really interesting. This collection of short stories is by author John McNally. It is called The Fear of Everything. Sounds a little ominous, right? But yeah, The Fear of Everything, and I will be speaking to John on the next episode. If you are a fan of this podcast, and I hope you are, I hope you will help us out by doing a couple of things. First, follow us on social media. You can follow GSMC Book Review Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also write a review or give us a 5-star review. I mean, obviously, if you don't think we're 5 stars, you don't have to give us a 5-star review, but 5 stars would be awesome. Anyway, you can write a review. You can give us a starred review. Those really help us to get this podcast out to more listeners such as yourself. And in terms of social media, please do not only follow but interact with me on social media. I love to hear your questions. I love to hear your thoughts on interviews and the books that you're reading and the authors that I'm interviewing. I love hearing from listeners, so please do interact with me on social media. I would greatly appreciate it, and I greatly appreciate each and every one of you. Again, I hope that whatever you're doing today, you are having a wonderful day, and that day will entail some time to get lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.